Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another evening of chilling tales told beneath the gentle patter of rain. I'm here to guide you through the darkness tonight, sharing stories that will both unsettle and soothe you into peaceful slumber. Before we begin our journey into the shadows, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you find comfort in these nocturnal narratives. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, settle into your most comfortable position, close your eyes, and let the rain wash away the worries of the day as we explore the thin places where reality becomes uncertain. The nursing home had always felt different during the night shift, but Margaret Chen couldn't quite explain why until she started working the graveyard hours at Sunset Manor. The corridors stretched longer in the darkness, and the familiar sounds of day gave way to something altogether more unsettling. She'd been a registered nurse for 15 years, but nothing had prepared her for the peculiar atmosphere that descended upon the facility after midnight. It began with Mrs. Holloway in room 12. Margaret found her one night standing at her window, pressing her palms against the glass with an intensity that made the nurse pause in the doorway. The elderly woman was humming something low and melodic, a tune that seemed to drift through the walls and settle into the very foundation of the building. When Margaret approached to guide her back to bed, Mrs. Holloway turned with eyes that reflected the hallway lights in an unusual way. "He's coming up the path again," she whispered, her voice carrying a weight that made Margaret glance toward the window. The grounds outside appeared empty, bathed in the pale glow of security lighting, but something about the shadows between the oak trees seemed to shift and move with purpose. Margaret had worked with dementia patients before, understood the confusion and disorientation that came with the condition. But Mrs. Holloway's certainty was different. There was a clarity in her voice that suggested she was seeing something very real, something that existed just beyond the perception of others. Over the following weeks, Margaret noticed a pattern emerging. Other residents began exhibiting similar behaviors, always between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning. Mr. Garrett would sit on the edge of his bed, hands folded neatly in his lap, speaking in hushed tones to the empty chair beside him. His words were too soft to understand, but his posture suggested he was engaged in deep conversation with someone whose responses only he could hear. Mrs. Patterson, usually confined to her wheelchair due to advanced arthritis, was found standing in the hallway one night, her gnarled fingers tracing patterns on the wallpaper that seemed to follow some invisible design. When Margaret asked what she was doing, the old woman smiled with a serenity that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. "Helping them find their way," she said simply, continuing her careful movements along the wall. "They get confused sometimes, forget which door leads home." The administrator, a practical woman named Dr. Sarah Collins, attributed these incidents to sundowing, the common phenomenon where dementia symptoms worsen during evening hours. She increased the medication dosages and installed additional lighting in the corridors, but the behaviors continued with clockwork regularity. Margaret began keeping detailed notes, documenting each incident with the precision her medical training had instilled. The patterns she discovered defied logical explanation. The residents affected were from different wings of the facility, had varying degrees of cognitive decline, and were on completely different medication regimens. Yet they all shared these nocturnal episodes that seemed coordinated despite their physical separation. The breakthrough came on a particularly stormy night in late October. Margaret was completing her rounds when she heard singing coming from the common room. Not the confused muttering or agitated vocalizations she'd grown accustomed to, but clear, harmonious voices joined in a melody that raised goosebumps along her arms. She found 12 residents gathered in a circle, some in wheelchairs, others standing despite mobility issues that should have made such movement impossible. They faced inward, their eyes closed in concentration, voices blending in a song that seemed older than memory itself. The words were unclear, possibly in a language Margaret didn't recognize, but the emotion behind them was unmistakable. It was a song of welcome, of invitation, of opening doors that had long remained closed. At the center of their circle sat Mrs. Holloway, no longer the frail woman Margaret knew from the day shift. Her posture was straight, her voice strong and clear as she led the others in their mysterious chorus. When she opened her eyes and looked directly at Margaret, the nurse felt as though she was being evaluated by something ancient and patient. "You see us now," Mrs. Holloway said, though her lips hadn't moved and her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You're finally ready to understand what we've been trying to show you." Margaret wanted to speak, to ask questions, to apply her medical knowledge to what she was witnessing, but her voice caught in her throat. The air in the room had grown thick, almost viscous, and she could feel presences around her that had nothing to do with the visible residents. Shadows moved independently of their sources, stretching and reaching toward something beyond her comprehension. "They come to us first," Mrs. Holloway continued, her actual voice now joining the explanation that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "Those who are ready to cross over, who stand at the threshold between worlds. We help them transition, guide them through the space between heartbeats, where the living and the departed can meet." The singing grew louder, more insistent, and Margaret began to see them clearly. Figures that were almost but not quite human, standing behind each of the residents, their forms flickering between solid and transparent. Some appeared to be family members, their faces carrying the weight of years and love and loss. Others were strangers, yet somehow familiar, as if Margaret had known them in dreams or distant memories. The facility was built on old ground, Mrs. Holloway explained, rising from her chair with a grace that belied her age and condition. Ground where people have been crossing over for generations. The residents don't have dementia, Margaret. They have sight. The dying can see what the living choose to ignore. Margaret felt her worldview shifting, the rational explanations she'd relied upon crumbling like paper in rain. The medication schedules, the diagnostic criteria, the careful documentation of symptoms, all of it seemed suddenly inadequate to explain what stood before her. These weren't patients suffering from cognitive decline. They were intermediaries, bridges between worlds, chosen for their proximity to the great transition that awaited everyone. "What do you want from me?" Margaret managed to whisper, though she wasn't entirely sure who she was addressing. The singing stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete that Margaret could hear her own heartbeat echoing in the room. The residents remained in their circle, but their attention had shifted to her, their eyes reflecting depths of knowledge that medical school had never prepared her to encounter. "Nothing from you," Mrs. Holloway replied, settling back into her chair as if the supernatural display had been nothing more than an evening's entertainment. "Something for you. The gift of understanding. You work among us, care for us, but you never truly saw us until now. Tonight, that changes." Margaret blinked, and suddenly the room appeared normal again. The residents were gone, presumably returned to their rooms, though she couldn't remember seeing them leave. The common room stood empty except for the lingering scent of something floral and old, like roses pressed between the pages of ancient books. She checked her watch. 4:37 in the morning. Nearly 2 hours had passed, though it felt like moments. Her notes from the evening were incomplete. ending mid-sentence at an observation about Mrs. Patterson's unusual mobility. Everything after that existed only in her memory, vivid and undeniable but impossible to document in any meaningful way. The next morning brought its usual routines, but Margaret found herself viewing everything through different eyes. The residents who had seemed confused and disoriented during her previous shifts now appeared purposeful, their seemingly random behaviors taking on new significance. They were working, she realized, serving as conduits for something larger than individual existence. Dr. Collins noticed the change in Margaret's reports, the subtle shift from clinical detachment to something that bordered on reverence. During their weekly meeting, she expressed concern about potential burnout, the emotional toll that long-term care could take on even the most experienced nurses. "Perhaps you'd benefit from rotating back to day shifts," Dr. Collins suggested, her tone gentle but firm. "The night hours can be isolating, lead to misinterpretation of normal behaviors." Margaret nodded and accepted the transfer, understanding that her supervisor was trying to help in the only way she knew how. But as she prepared for her final night shift, she felt a profound sense of loss. She was being removed from something important, something that had chosen to reveal itself to her after years of remaining hidden. Her last evening at Sunset Manor was quiet, almost disappointingly normal. The residents slept peacefully, their medications keeping them sedated through the hours when their true work began. Margaret completed her rounds with mechanical efficiency, documenting vital signs and medication administration with the same professional detachment she'd once prided herself on. But as she prepared to leave, Mrs. Holloway called out from her room. Margaret found her sitting by the window, no longer pressing against the glass, but simply gazing out at the grounds with an expression of infinite patience. "They'll still come," she said, without turning around. "Whether you're here to witness it or not, the work continues as it always has, as it always will. But it was good that you saw, even briefly. It means you understand now that death isn't an ending. It's simply a change in perspective." Margaret wanted to stay, to learn more about this hidden world that existed parallel to the one she thought she knew. But her shift was ending, and day staff was arriving, and the rational world was reasserting its hold on the facility. As she walked to her car in the pale light of dawn, Margaret turned back one final time to look at Sunset Manor. In several windows, she could see figures standing watch. Some she recognized as residents, others as the translucent beings who worked alongside them. They raised their hands in farewell, a gesture that seemed to acknowledge her brief inclusion in their eternal vigil. The rain had begun to fall, gentle drops that seemed to wash the night's mysteries from the world, preparing it for another day of ordinary concerns and rational explanations. Margaret drove home through the storm, carrying with her the knowledge that some truths could only be glimpsed in darkness, in the quiet hours when the barrier between worlds grew thin enough for the living to see what waited beyond. Margaret's transition back today, shifts felt like moving from one world to another, each governed by different rules and populated by different versions of the same people. During daylight hours, the residents of Sunset Manor appeared exactly as medical textbooks described. Elderly individuals struggling with various stages of cognitive decline, their behaviors explicable through pharmaceutical interventions and therapeutic protocols. But Margaret carried the weight of what she had witnessed, and that knowledge changed everything about how she perceived her work. Mrs. Holloway, who spent her days staring vacantly at game shows on the common room television, would catch Margaret's eye and offer the faintest smile, as if sharing a secret that belonged only to them. The knowing look suggested that whatever transformations occurred during the night hours remained accessible to those who had been granted sight. The day shift supervisor, Janet Reeves, was a no-nonsense woman who had worked in geriatric care for over 20 years. She ran her team with military precision, focusing on measurable outcomes and standardized procedures. During Margaret's first week back on days, Janet pulled her aside to discuss what she termed concerning patterns in Margaret's recent documentation. "Your notes from the night shifts show some unusual observations," Janet said, spreading Margaret's reports across her desk. "References to coordinated behaviors, mentions of residents displaying capabilities inconsistent with their diagnoses. I understand the night hours can be challenging, but we need to maintain clinical objectivity." Margaret nodded, understanding that Janet was doing her job, protecting both the facility and its staff from liability issues that could arise from unsubstantiated claims. She began editing her observations, translating her experiences into acceptable medical terminology. What she had witnessed as purposeful gathering became increased nocturnal wandering requiring redirection. The harmonious singing transformed into vocalizations consistent with sundowing behaviors. Yet even during the busy daylight hours, Margaret noticed subtleties that her previous experience had taught her to recognize. Residents would position themselves in specific locations throughout the facility, creating patterns that seemed random to untrained eyes, but held deeper significance for those who understood their true purpose. Mr. Garrett would wheel himself to the junction of two hallways, positioning his chair at precise angles that allowed him to monitor multiple directions simultaneously. Mrs. Patterson, despite her arthritis, would find reasons to touch certain sections of wallpaper, her fingers tracing invisible pathways that connected different areas of the building. The families who visited during afternoon hours remained oblivious to these subtle communications. They saw their loved ones as diminished versions of their former selves, spoke to them in loud, simplified sentences, and discussed their conditions in whispered conferences with medical staff. Margaret watched these interactions with new understanding, recognizing the profound disconnect between perceived reality and the complex work their relatives performed during the hidden hours. Dr. Collins called a staff meeting in early November to address what she described as concerning incidents that had occurred during recent night shifts. The new overnight nurse, a young man named David Torres, had filed several reports describing unusual group activities among residents who were supposedly sedated. His documentation was clinical but clearly troubled, describing scenarios that eerily echoed Margaret's own experiences. "We need to consider whether our current medication protocols are adequate," Dr. Collins announced to the assembled staff. "If residents are experiencing breakthrough symptoms that allow for this level of coordinated activity, we may need to adjust dosages or timing of administration." Margaret felt a chill of recognition as she listened to David's reports being discussed as medical problems requiring pharmaceutical solutions. The administration was preparing to medicate away the variabilities that allowed residents to serve their hidden purpose, to chemically silence the bridge between worlds that the facility had unknowingly hosted for years. After the meeting, Margaret lingered in the break room, pretending to organize her locker while waiting for an opportunity to speak with David privately. When the other staff members had dispersed, she approached him with careful casualness. "The incidents you've been documenting," she began, keeping her voice low. "Have you noticed any patterns in timing or participant selection?" David's eyes widened slightly, and she could see the relief of finding someone who might understand his confusion. "You've seen it too, haven't you? The way they move together, like they're responding to signals no one else can detect. And the singing. I've never heard anything like it. It's beautiful and terrifying at the same time." Margaret glanced around the empty break room, ensuring their conversation would remain private. "What you're witnessing isn't pathological behavior. These residents are serving a function that extends beyond their medical diagnoses. The facility sits on ground with a long history of transition and passage. They're facilitating something that has been happening here for generations. David listened intently as Margaret shared her own experiences, describing the night she had been allowed to witness the full extent of the residents' capabilities. His expression shifted from confusion to wonder to a deep concern that mirrored her own. "Dr. Collins is planning to increase their medication," he said quietly. "She wants to eliminate what she sees as breakthrough symptoms. But if what you're telling me is true, we'd be stopping something important, something necessary." The ethical implications of their situation were staggering. How could they advocate for reducing medication when doing so contradicted established medical protocols? How could they explain to administrators that their patients were performing essential work that transcended conventional understanding of death and dying? The very language needed to discuss such concepts existed outside the vocabulary of modern healthcare. Margaret made a decision that would have seemed impossible during her early years as a nurse. She began documenting her observations in a private journal, creating a record that existed parallel to official medical files. She noted the subtle ways residents positioned themselves throughout the facility, the timing of their coordinated activities, and the peaceful expressions that crossed their faces during moments when they appeared to be communicating with invisible presences. The journal grew thick with observations that painted a picture of Sunset Manor as something far more significant than a long-term care facility. It was a way station, a place where those preparing to leave the physical world could receive guidance from others who stood at the same threshold. The residents weren't declining. They were evolving, developing abilities that allowed them to perceive and interact with dimensions beyond ordinary human experience. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a series of deaths that would have seemed routine to anyone unfamiliar with the facility's hidden nature. 3 residents passed within a 2-week period, each death occurring during the early morning hours when the barrier between worlds was thinnest. But Margaret noticed something that the official records couldn't capture. Each passing was preceded by nights of intense activity among the surviving residents, as if they were preparing their departing colleagues for the journey ahead. Mrs. Holloway was among those who died, slipping away peacefully in her sleep on a Tuesday morning in December. Margaret was working the day shift when it happened, arriving to find the woman's room empty except for the lingering scent of roses that had become associated with the facility's mysteries. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac failure, a common and unremarkable end for someone of her age and condition. But that evening, Margaret made an unprecedented decision. She volunteered to work a double shift, staying through the night hours to observe how the remaining residents would respond to Mrs. Holloway's passing. David, who had become her unofficial partner in documenting the facility's hidden activities, agreed to coordinate their observations. What they witnessed that night challenged every assumption about death, grief, and the continuation of consciousness beyond physical existence. The surviving residents gathered in the common room without any apparent coordination, arranging themselves in the same circular pattern Margaret remembered from months earlier. But this time, there was an empty space in their formation, a gap that seemed to pulse with invisible presence. The singing began at exactly 2:37 in the morning. The same melody Margaret had heard before, but with new harmonies that suggested additional voices joining from beyond the visible world. The residents' faces glowed with an inner light that had nothing to do with the facility's fluorescent fixtures, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with energy that made the boundaries between dimensions permeable. In the center of their circle, where Mrs. Holloway would have sat, the space began to take on form and substance, not enough to create a visible figure, but sufficient to suggest presence, consciousness, continued existence in a form that transcended physical limitations. The other residents reached out with hands that trembled not from age or infirmity, but from the profound effort of maintaining contact across the boundary between life and death. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she understood what she was witnessing. This wasn't a goodbye. It was a confirmation. Mrs. Holloway hadn't departed. She had simply shifted into a different mode of being, one that allowed her to continue the work she had performed while living, but from a perspective that encompassed both worlds simultaneously. The ceremony, for that's what Margaret now recognized it to be, continued for nearly an hour. When it concluded, the residents dispersed to their rooms with expressions of peace and completion that no medication could have provided. They had successfully guided their colleague through the transition, ensuring that the continuity of their work remained unbroken despite the apparent finality of physical death. David found Margaret in the hallway afterward, both of them struggling to process what they had witnessed. The implications extended far beyond their immediate situation, challenging fundamental assumptions about consciousness, identity, and the nature of existence itself. "We need to protect this," Margaret said finally, her voice hoarse from emotion. "Whatever it takes, we can't let them medicate it away. This isn't pathology. It's purpose. These people are serving something larger than individual existence." The next morning brought new challenges as Dr. Collins announced plans for a comprehensive review of all medication protocols, specifically targeting the nighttime behaviors that had been documented with increasing frequency. Margaret realized that time was running short, that the window for preserving the facility's hidden function might be closing rapidly. She made copies of her private journal, storing them in locations where they would survive any potential investigation or administrative purge. If the work of Sunset Manor's residents was to be chemically silenced, at least there would be a record of what had been lost, a testament to the profound service these individuals had provided during their final years of life. The rain continued to fall outside the facility's windows, each drop carrying with it the weight of mysteries that most people would never comprehend. But Margaret had been granted sight, had been allowed to witness the thin places where reality became negotiable, where the dying served as guides for both the living and the departed. As she prepared her notes for another day of careful documentation and diplomatic translation, Margaret wondered how many other facilities harbored similar secrets. How many apparently diminished individuals were actually performing work of cosmic significance. The questions would remain unanswered, but the knowledge would persist, carried by those who had been chosen to see beyond the veil of ordinary perception. The weeks following Mrs. Holloway's passing brought subtle changes to Sunset Manor that only those with trained eyes could detect. Margaret noticed how the remaining residents had reorganized themselves, filling the gaps left by their departed colleague while maintaining the delicate balance of their nocturnal work. New patterns emerged in their daytime positioning, creating networks of connection that spanned the entire facility. Mr. Garrett had assumed a more prominent role in the group's activities, his wheelchair serving as an anchor point around which others oriented themselves. During visiting hours, he appeared to be merely an elderly man dozing in the afternoon sun that streamed through the common room windows. But Margaret observed how he tracked the movements of staff and visitors with subtle glances, his awareness extending far beyond what his medical chart suggested was possible. The new residents who arrived to fill the vacant rooms brought their own unique complications. Most were transfers from other facilities or recent admissions, whose families sought specialized dementia care. They arrived with detailed medical histories and carefully calibrated medication regimens designed to manage behaviors that their previous caregivers had found disruptive or concerning. Margaret watched with growing apprehension as these newcomers struggled to adapt to the facility's hidden rhythms. Some seemed naturally attuned to the subtle energies that permeated Sunset Manor, beginning to exhibit the telltale signs of developing sight within days of their arrival. Others remained locked within the conventional understanding of their conditions, their medications effectively blocking any perception beyond ordinary reality. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez arrived on a particularly gray morning in January, transferred from a facility in the neighboring county after what her files described as increasingly agitated nocturnal behaviors requiring intensive intervention. Her daughter, a harried-looking woman in her 50s, spoke in hushed tones with Dr. Collins about the need for stronger sedatives and more restrictive monitoring. "She keeps talking about visitors that no one else can see," the daughter explained, her frustration evident in every word. "She'll stand at her window for hours, having conversations with empty air." The other facility said it was advanced dementia, but the medications they tried didn't help. If anything, they seemed to make her more distressed. Margaret recognized the familiar pattern immediately. Mrs. Vasquez wasn't experiencing hallucinations. She was developing the ability to perceive the facility's hidden residents, the translucent beings who worked alongside the living to facilitate transitions between worlds. Her distress came not from confusion, but from isolation. She could see them, but no one around her acknowledged their existence. That evening, Margaret volunteered for another double shift, positioning herself to observe how the established residents would respond to Mrs. Vasquez's arrival. The integration process, she had learned, was delicate and crucial. New members of their hidden community needed guidance and acceptance, or they risked becoming trapped between worlds, able to perceive both but belonging fully to neither. The first contact came at 2:15 in the morning. Margaret watched from her position at the nurse's station as Mrs. Patterson made her way slowly down the hallway, her arthritic hands trailing along the wallpaper in patterns that had become familiar. She paused outside Mrs. Vasquez's room, her fingers tracing more complex designs on the doorframe, as if sending signals through the building's structure itself. Minutes later, Mrs. Vasquez appeared in her doorway, her eyes wide but alert rather than confused. The two women regarded each other for a long moment, communicating through glances and subtle gestures that conveyed volumes of information. Mrs. Patterson extended her hand, and Mrs. Vasquez took it without hesitation, allowing herself to be led toward the common room where other figures were beginning to gather. Margaret followed at a discreet distance, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting that absorbed sound in ways that seemed almost intentional. The common room was transforming again, the furniture seeming to rearrange itself to accommodate the expanding circle of participants. Mrs. Vasquez took her place among them naturally, as if she had been practicing for this moment throughout her life. The singing that night was different, incorporating new harmonies that welcomed Mrs. Vasquez into their eternal chorus. Her voice, uncertain at first, grew stronger as she found her place within the melody. The translucent figures that surrounded them seemed to pulse with approval, their forms becoming more substantial in response to the expanding group's combined energy. Margaret realized she was witnessing something akin to an initiation ceremony, a formal induction into responsibilities that transcended the boundaries of individual existence. Mrs. Vasquez was being taught her role in the great work that occurred within these walls, receiving instruction that would allow her to serve as a bridge between the living and the departed. The ceremony concluded with a moment of profound silence, during which Margaret felt the presence of something vast and ancient, acknowledging the new addition to its earthly servants. When the residents finally dispersed to their rooms, Mrs. Vasquez walked with the same purposeful grace that characterized the others, her previous agitation replaced by serene understanding of her true purpose. The transformation was immediately apparent during the following day's activities. Mrs. Vasquez participated in scheduled programs with polite engagement, but Margaret could see the deeper awareness that now guided her actions. She positioned herself strategically during meals, her presence creating subtle energy patterns that connected different areas of the dining room. During craft hour, she worked on projects that appeared random to casual observers, but followed geometric principles that Margaret was beginning to recognize as significant. Dr. Collins noted the improvement in Mrs. Vasquez's behavioral reports with professional satisfaction, attributing the change to the facility's specialized care environment and adjusted medication protocols. She was unaware that the true healing had come not from pharmaceutical intervention, but from acceptance into a community that understood and valued Mrs. Vasquez's unique perceptions. The winter months brought additional challenges as David Torres began reporting concerns about his own experiences during the night shifts. The constant exposure to the facility's hidden activities was affecting him in ways that medical training had not prepared him to handle. He confided to Margaret that he had begun to see the translucent figures even during daylight hours, their presence becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss as tricks of lighting or fatigue-induced hallucinations. "I think I'm losing my grip on what's real," he admitted during one of their clandestine meetings in the supply closet. "Yesterday, I found myself having a conversation with someone who wasn't there, at least not in any conventional sense. The other staff members looked at me like I was having a breakdown, but the resident I was supposedly talking to myself was nodding and responding as if she could hear both sides of the conversation." Margaret understood the difficulty of his situation. Prolonged exposure to the facility's supernatural activities created a gradual expansion of perception that could be overwhelming for those unprepared for such revelations. The boundary between ordinary reality and the hidden world was becoming permeable for David, just as it had for her months earlier. She began sharing techniques she had developed for managing the dual awareness that came with seeing beyond the veil of conventional reality. Meditation practices that helped maintain psychological stability while remaining open to expanded perception. Methods for documenting experiences in ways that satisfied administrative requirements while preserving the truth for those capable of understanding it. Most importantly, she taught him the art of selective disclosure, sharing insights only with individuals who demonstrated readiness to receive such knowledge. The arrival of spring brought new residents and new challenges to the delicate balance that the facility's hidden community had maintained throughout the winter months. Among the newcomers was a man whose presence immediately disrupted the careful patterns that had been established over months of patient work. Dr. Franklin Pierce arrived with credentials that impressed the administrative staff, but set Margaret's nerves on edge from their first meeting. He claimed to be a specialist in geriatric psychiatry, with particular expertise in managing what he termed paranormal delusions among elderly patients. His research focused on pharmaceutical interventions that could eliminate supernatural experiences, which he categorized as symptoms of neurological dysfunction requiring aggressive treatment. During his initial consultation with Dr. Collins, Dr. Pierce reviewed the facility's incident reports, with particular attention to David's documentation of unusual nighttime activities. His recommendations were swift and decisive. Immediate implementation of enhanced sedation protocols designed to eliminate all nocturnal wandering and group gatherings among residents. These coordinated behaviors represent a form of shared psychosis, he explained to THED staff during his first meeting. Left untreated, they can escalate into dangerous delusions that compromise patient safety and facility liability. The solution is pharmacological intervention that targets the neurochemical pathways responsible for these aberrant experiences. Margaret felt her heart sink as she listened to Dr. Pierce outline his treatment plan. He was proposing to chemically lobotomize the facility's residents, stripping away their ability to perceive the hidden dimensions of reality in the name of medical orthodoxy. The ancient work that had been performed within these walls for generations would be silenced by a cocktail of psychoactive drugs administered in the service of normalcy. That evening, Margaret made a decision that would have seemed impossible during her early years as a healthcare professional. She began systematically documenting Dr. Pierce's proposed interventions, creating a detailed record of the medications he intended to prescribe and their expected effects on the residents' expanded consciousness. If the hidden community was to be destroyed, she would ensure that evidence of its existence survived for future generations who might be more ready to understand its significance. The first implementation of Dr. Pierce's protocol came the following week, beginning with the newest residents who had shown signs of developing supernatural awareness. Mrs. Vasquez was among the first to receive the enhanced sedation. Her evening medication increased to levels that would render her unconscious throughout the crucial nighttime hours when the facility's true work occurred. The effect was immediate and devastating. Mrs. Vasquez, who had found peace and purpose within the hidden community, returned to the agitated confusion that had characterized her previous facility stay. She wandered the hallways during permitted hours with expressions of profound loss, reaching out to touch walls and door frames as if searching for connections that no longer existed. The other residents responded to these changes with subtle but unmistakable distress. Their carefully maintained patterns began to fragment as key members of their community were chemically isolated from the work they had been called to perform. The translucent figures that had grown more substantial over the winter months began to fade, their forms becoming increasingly ephemeral as the bridge between worlds weakened. Margaret watched the systematic destruction of something sacred with growing desperation. Each new implementation of Dr. Pierce's protocols eliminated another voice from the midnight chorus, another link in the chain that connected the living world to whatever lay beyond physical death. The facility was being transformed from a way station for souls in transition into a conventional medical warehouse for the warehousing of declining bodies. David Torres submitted his resignation on a Friday morning in March, his letter citing personal reasons that masked the true cause of his departure. He could no longer bear witness to the destruction of something he had come to understand as profoundly meaningful. His final conversation with Margaret was brief, but loaded with shared grief for the loss they were powerless to prevent. "They're turning this place into just another nursing home," he said, his voice heavy with defeat. "All the wonder, all the purpose reduced to symptoms requiring treatment. I can't be complicit in that anymore." Margaret understood his decision, even as it left her increasingly isolated in her knowledge of what was being lost. She was now the sole witness to the facility's transformation, the only staff member who remembered what Sunset Manor had been before Dr. Pierce's interventions began reshaping its essential nature. The spring rains that began in April seemed to weep for the changes occurring within the facility's walls. Margaret found herself working longer hours, staying late into the evening shift to document the gradual disappearance of the supernatural activities that had once defined the place. Her private journal filled with observations of decline, noting how each new medication protocol eliminated another aspect of the residents' hidden abilities. By May, the midnight gatherings had ceased entirely. The residents who had once served as bridges between worlds now spent their nights in chemically induced sleep, their dreams presumably empty of the visions that had once allowed them to guide departing souls through the transition from life to whatever came after. The common room, which had once hosted ceremonies of profound spiritual significance, became nothing more than a space for daytime television and supervised craft activities. Dr. Pierce presented his preliminary findings at a regional conference on geriatric psychiatry, describing his successful elimination of what he termed nocturnal paranormal episodes among nursing home residents. His paper, which Margaret obtained through professional contacts, reduced the sacred work she had witnessed to a series of symptoms successfully treated through pharmaceutical intervention. The final blow came in June, when Dr. Collins announced that the facility had been selected as a model for Dr. Pierce's treatment protocols, with plans to expand his methods to other long-term care facilities throughout the region. Sunset Manor would become a training center where healthcare professionals could learn to identify and eliminate supernatural experiences among elderly patients. Margaret submitted her own resignation that afternoon, knowing she could no longer remain complicit in the destruction of something she had come to understand as essential to the natural order of existence. Her letter was professionally worded and cited career advancement opportunities elsewhere. But privately, she understood that she was fleeing from the scene of a crime against the divine. Her final shift at Sunset Manor was scheduled for a rainy Thursday evening in late June. As she walked the familiar corridors one last time, Margaret felt the weight of all the stories that would never be told, all the souls who would face their final transition without the guidance that had once been available within these walls. The facility had been stripped of its sacred purpose, reduced to a mundane warehouse for the storage of declining bodies. Yet as she completed her final documentation and prepared to turn in her access badge, Margaret noticed something that gave her a glimmer of hope. In the margins of her official reports, she began leaving subtle notations that future readers might recognize as significant. Coordinates that marked the locations where ceremonies had occurred. Timestamps that indicated when the barriers between worlds had been thinnest. Coded references that might someday guide others to rediscover what had been lost. The rain intensified as Margaret walked to her car for the final time, each drop carrying with it the memory of mysteries that had once flourished within these walls. She drove home through the storm, carrying with her the knowledge that some truths could survive even the most determined attempts to suppress them, waiting in darkness for those brave enough to seek them out. As Margaret drove through the rain-soaked streets away from Sunset Manor, she carried with her more than just personal belongings and professional credentials. Hidden within her purse was a small digital recorder containing hours of audio documentation from her final weeks at the facility. The recordings captured fragments of the midnight ceremonies, the haunting melodies that had once filled the common room during those sacred gatherings. She had made these recordings secretly, positioning the device in locations where it could capture the otherworldly harmonies without detection. The quality was poor, distorted by the facility's thick walls and the ethereal nature of the voices themselves, but they represented the only tangible proof of what had been systematically erased by Dr. Pierce's protocols. Margaret's apartment felt strange after months of living between two worlds. The ordinary sounds of traffic and neighbors seemed mundane compared to the profound silences that had once filled Sunset Manor during its most significant moments. She found herself listening for footsteps that would never come, waiting for voices that had been chemically silenced forever. The recordings became her obsession during the long summer nights that followed her resignation. She played them repeatedly, analyzing each whispered word and melodic phrase for clues about the greater purpose that had been served within the facility's walls. Slowly, patterns began to emerge that suggested the work performed there was part of something much larger than she had initially understood. The ceremonies hadn't been isolated events, but rather components of an ancient network that spanned multiple locations and generations. References in the recordings pointed to other facilities, other communities of individuals who served similar functions in guiding souls through their final transitions. Margaret realized she had witnessed only one node in a vast web of supernatural activity that existed parallel to ordinary reality. Her research led her to historical records that painted a disturbing picture of systematic suppression stretching back decades. Other facilities that had once harbored similar phenomena had undergone transformations remarkably similar to what she had witnessed at Sunset Manor. Medical professionals who had attempted to document or protect these activities had found their careers destroyed, their credibility questioned, their observations dismissed as symptoms of professional burnout or psychological instability. Dr. Pierce, she discovered, was not an isolated case, but rather part of a coordinated effort to eliminate supernatural experiences from institutional care settings. His methods were being implemented across the country, backed by pharmaceutical companies whose profits depended on expanding markets for psychoactive medications. The systematic destruction of sacred spaces was being conducted under the banner of medical progress and patient safety. Margaret began reaching out to other healthcare professionals who might have witnessed similar phenomena, using coded language in professional forums to identify potential allies. The responses were cautious but revealing. Nurses, orderlies, and even some physicians had observed activities that defied conventional explanation. But few dared to discuss them openly for fear of professional repercussions. A private message from a nurse in Oregon provided the first concrete evidence that the network Margaret had theorized actually existed. The woman described experiences at a hospice facility that mirrored almost exactly what Margaret had witnessed at Sunset Manor. Patients who should have been unconscious gathering in common areas during the early morning hours, participating in rituals that seemed to ease the transition of those preparing to die. They tried to stop it here too, the message read. Brought in specialists who said the behaviors were symptomatic of mass hysteria or shared delusions. The medications they prescribed eliminated the gatherings, but something else was lost too. The patients became more agitated, more fearful as they approached death. It was as if they were facing the final journey without the guidance they had previously received. Similar stories emerged from contacts in Texas, Maine, and California. A pattern of suppression that suggested coordinated efforts to eliminate supernatural phenomena from end-of-life care facilities across the nation. The ancient network of guides and waypoints was being systematically dismantled by individuals who saw such activities as obstacles to efficient medical management rather than essential spiritual services. Margaret decided to document everything in a comprehensive report that would serve as testimony for future generations. She compiled the audio recordings, historical research, and personal accounts into a detailed analysis of what was being lost and why its preservation mattered. The work consumed her autumn evenings, filling page after page with evidence that most people would dismiss as fantasy, but that represented profound truth for those capable of recognizing it. The report grew to encompass not just her experiences at Sunset Manor, but the broader implications of suppressing humanity's connection to the supernatural realm. She wrote about the psychological impact on patients who were denied access to the spiritual guidance that had once been available during their final transitions. She documented the correlation between increased medication protocols and rising levels of anxiety and distress among hospice residents. Most importantly, she attempted to articulate the cosmic significance of the work that had been performed by individuals like Mrs. Holloway and her companions. These weren't simply elderly people experiencing hallucinations or delusions. They were serving as intermediaries between dimensions, facilitating communications and transitions that were essential to the natural order of existence. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a series of dreams that seemed more like visitations than ordinary nocturnal experiences. Margaret found herself standing in familiar corridors, observing ceremonies that no longer occurred in physical reality, but continued to exist in some parallel dimension where the work could proceed uninterrupted by pharmaceutical interventions. In these dreams, Mrs. Holloway appeared frequently, her form more substantial than it had been during her final days at the facility. She spoke of continuity despite disruption, of work that persisted even when its earthly anchors were severed by chemical means. The network remained intact, she explained, operating through channels that existed beyond the reach of medical suppression. The living forget, Mrs. Holloway said during one particularly vivid encounter. But forgetting doesn't eliminate truth. What was done at our facility, what is being done at others like it, creates disturbances that ripple through dimensions. The balance is being disrupted, but balance always seeks to restore itself. Margaret began to understand that her role had evolved beyond simple documentation. She was being called to serve as a bridge herself, carrying knowledge across the gap created by systematic suppression. The recordings she had made, the report she was compiling, the network of contacts she was developing, all of it was preparation for something larger than individual testimony. The revelation came on a December evening when Margaret received a phone call from David Torres. His voice carried excitement mixed with apprehension as he described his new position at a facility in Colorado, where he had begun observing familiar patterns among the residents. "It's starting again," he said. His words rushed with urgency. Different people, different location, but the same essential activities. They're gathering at night, communicating with presences that others can't see. And Margaret, there's something else. They're asking about you specifically. Somehow they know about your experiences at Sunset Manor. The implications were staggering. The network wasn't simply rebuilding itself. It was actively seeking out individuals who possessed the knowledge and sensitivity necessary to protect and nurture its manifestations. Margaret realized she was being recruited not just as a witness, but as a guardian. Someone whose understanding could help preserve these sacred activities from future suppression efforts. Her decision to accept David's invitation to visit the Colorado facility marked a turning point in her understanding of her own purpose. She was no longer simply a nurse who had happened to witness extraordinary phenomena. She was becoming part of the network herself, developing abilities that would allow her to serve as more than just an observer of the supernatural activities that occurred at the margins of ordinary reality. The flight to Denver took her over landscapes that appeared different when viewed with expanded awareness. Patterns in the geography below suggested ancient pathways and gathering points, locations where the boundary between dimensions had always been thin. Margaret began to perceive the world as a vast web of interconnected sacred sites, most of them forgotten or suppressed, but still pulsing with dormant energy. David met her at the airport with expressions that mixed relief with trepidation. His experiences at the new facility had been more intense than what either of them had witnessed at Sunset Manor. As if the network was compensating for losses elsewhere by concentrating its activities in locations where protection was available. "They've been waiting for you," he said, as they drove through the Colorado evening toward the mountains where the facility was located. "Not just expecting you, but actively preparing for your arrival. I think your documentation work at Sunset Manor marked you somehow, identified you as someone who could be trusted with deeper knowledge." The facility, nestled among pine-covered peaks that reminded Margaret of her childhood visits to her grandmother's mountain cabin, appeared unremarkable from the exterior. But as they entered the building, she felt the familiar electricity that indicated the presence of expanded consciousness, operating just beneath the surface of ordinary perception. The residents who greeted their arrival did so with recognition that extended beyond mere politeness. Their eyes held depths of knowledge that Margaret remembered from her encounters with Mrs. Holloway and her companions. These individuals weren't simply elderly patients requiring care. They were active participants in work that transcended the boundaries of individual existence. That first night in Colorado confirmed everything Margaret had theorized about the network's persistence and adaptability. The gathering she was invited to witness was more elaborate than anything she had observed at Sunset Manor, involving not just the facility's residents, but translucent figures whose presence filled the common room with energy that made the air itself seem to pulse with purpose. The ceremony centered around a new arrival, a woman whose family had brought her to the facility after she began describing visitations from deceased relatives that no one else could see. Rather than medicating away these experiences, the staff at this location had recognized them as signs of developing sensitivity and had prepared her for integration into their hidden community. As the rain continues to fall outside your window tonight, washing away the remnants of another day and preparing the world for whatever mysteries tomorrow might bring, remember that Margaret's story is not unique. In facilities across the country, in quiet moments when the boundary between worlds grows thin, similar dramas unfold beyond the perception of those who choose to look away. The networks of consciousness that connect us all persist despite our best efforts to suppress them, waiting patiently for those brave enough to acknowledge their presence. Sweet dreams, and may you find peace in knowing that some truths endure beyond the reach of those who would silence them.